wanted to start by giving just a brief snapshot, literally and figuratively, of the place we're talking about. So this is the Union Stockyards circa 1907. And by the time of the Chicago race riot in July and August 1919, the city is already known as the hog butcher to the world. The stockyards themselves here cover about 400 acres. So this is where you have to think back to high school when you read The Jungle, talking about the sight of it, the sound of all these animals, the smell sort of overpowering this entire community. And it's dotted, you can kind of see in the back here, almost like satellites with meatpacking plants all around. Most importantly for our purposes here today is that the stockyards and the surrounding plants, by the time of the race riot, employ more than 40,000 people. So this is the largest single employer in Chicago in this period. So what I want to talk about today a little bit is the ways in which violence and race and work kind of intersected at this site before 1919, during 1919, and afterwards, and how this reverberates through the stockyards, the surrounding community, the Black Belt, and the historical memory of Chicago more generally. So to do this, we actually have to rewind a bit to 1904 to kind of set the scene a bit. In 1904, the stockyards are basically run by a union called the Amalgamated Meat Cutters and Butcher Workmen. So this unwieldy name is given to this union that's only for skilled workers. This is solely white, almost all native-born men within the stockyards. There's no room for unskilled workers. But in a rare show of solidarity, the Amalgamated decides to go on strike in solidarity with the unskilled workers who are looking for a pay increase. So this rare moment of solidarity among workers goes off in July of 1904 with about 20,000 workers going on strike, which is about 80% of the workforce. So a really big strike. This threatens the entire nation's meatpacking industry because this, of course, is the center of the meatpacking industry for America. So the meatpackers are not fools. They immediately bring in strikebreakers. And it's estimated that the majority of the strikebreakers, as many as 3/4 possibly, are white. So the Tribune says that they are a cosmopolitan mixture of Negroes, Italians, and Scandinavians. But for the strikers, it's the presence of African Americans as strikebreakers that becomes most infuriating. There's a few reasons for this. One is that the African American community in Chicago at this point is very, very small. Only about 2% of the population, only about 5% of the meatpacking workforce. The other thing is that the African American community, as we'll see, is very, very isolated, both physically in terms of segregation and culturally and socially. So when people who are strikebreakers from places like Italy or Scandinavia come to Chicago, they immediately fit into networks of ethnic kinship in other communities, which African Americans don't have access to. And in fact, many of the white strikebreakers in 1904 would go on to be the core of the union drive that I'll talk about in a second, around 1916. The biggest reason, though, is simple racism. So this whole panoply of racist stereotypes about black workers being unfit for union membership, unfit for skilled labor, unfit to work alongside whites. So one union representative in a local newspaper calls the black strikers debased, bestialized, and wholly without a sense of class solidarity, men in whom the savagery of Africa has been intensified by generations of the savagery of wage and chattel servitude, accompanied by a final education in the slums. So from the very beginning, there's a very incendiary racial aspect to this strike in 1904. The meatpackers, again, nobody's fool, exacerbate this at every turn. So they actually house the strikebreakers within the meatpacking plants and the stockyards. So as unpleasant as this is for the strikebreakers, it's infuriating to the strikers because now the strikebreakers are seen as an invading and occupying force that is taking not only their jobs, but occupying the physical space that they considered their own before the strike began. And this also fuels a whole series of rumors, again, based in very ugly racist stereotypes, that the black strikebreakers are gambling, drinking, bringing in prostitutes, having prize fights, things like that. So this quickly curdles into violence in and around the stockyards community. So any black strikebreakers that dare to leave the stockyards are set upon by strikers and beaten. And if there was any doubt that this is inherently racial, the white strikebreakers are not set upon, and more than that, African American Chicagoans who have no connection to the strike are also beaten. So when one sort of infamous case, a black strikebreaker is on a streetcar and a mob assembles to drag him off and beat him, but he's able to fight them off and escape. And in their fury, they go into a nearby barbershop and pull out a black barber supporter and beat him half to death. No connection to the strike, no connection to the Stockyards whatsoever. So one question that one might have that'll sort of recur later on is why African Americans engage in strikebreaking. One would be that for the most part, they don't actually know that they are until they get to Chicago and it's too late. So most of the strikebreakers, white and black, are recruited from outside of Chicago, often under false pretenses that they are going to staff a newly built furniture plant. That was the most popular lie told by labor agents. And then by the time they get to Chicago, far from home, no contacts, no money, it's far too late. It should also be noted that some of the strikebreakers themselves actually do go on strike in sort of an odd reversal, and refuse to work under the conditions and wages that the meatpackers have set. But for those who remain, the primary reason is that this is the first entree that African Americans have in large numbers to a relatively lucrative profession in this era. So many of them do remain. With that comes the much more poignant end to the strike, which is the strike peters out after about 2 months in September 1904. It's a total defeat for the Union. It's completely broken. The leaders of the strike are fired and blacklisted. The white strikebreakers are kept on. All of the black strikebreakers are fired because the meatpacking bosses feel that there would be animosity and even violence on the floor, and that's not really something they need. So by 1910, there are about 30,000 employees in the stockyards. Of those, the number of African American workers is 67. So what you have in the wake of this are a few lessons. For meatpacking bosses, the idea that race can be used as a cudgel against workers to divide and conquer. For black workers, you have the sense that unions are predominantly white institutions that are not really for them, that they won't be welcome, and they'll actively be chased out and even fended off with violence. For white workers, you had this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that they believed going in that African Americans did not have a sense of solidarity, were not inherently fit for union membership, and this seemed to fulfill itself for them, although of course they had a large hand in making it so. So if we fast forward now a few years, in the wake of this, the Chicago Federation of Labor suffers another defeat in 1905 in an extremely bloody Teamster strike that also has a great deal of racial violence. Accusations of graft and theft finally chase the president of the CFL out, and he's replaced in 1906 by the guy on the left, who's John Fitzpatrick, who is sort of the classic Chicago union member. So he's born in Ireland. He's kind of a big, burly, garrulous guy, very plain-spoken, very charismatic, insists on wearing only union clothes. You can actually see in his portrait the little bug of the photo engravers union there, which I'm sure he insisted upon. On the right, you have someone who's cut from a bit of a different cloth. That's William Z. Foster, who is a radical. He later becomes head of the American Communist Party. He gets his start in the Industrial Workers of the World, a very radical union. But he's in Chicago circa 1915. And together the two concoct a plan that has been called by John Keyser, historian of this era, progressive unionism, which is essentially that the one solution to this kind of strike breaking and disunity and violence is to organize everyone. That if you have a union that's not split up by skill level or gender or race, ethnicity, nationality, that the union would essentially be unbeatable. More than this, though, they believe that racism is essentially a labor problem. That the reason that white and black workers are committing violence against each other, not getting along, is because they're divided by people like the meatpacking bosses. And that if you create an interracial union, that all of that would just go away. So this is important to keep in mind later on when we talk about why this idea ultimately does not bear fruit. So they come up with this idea of actually trying to do this in 1915. So in 1915, the reason is, one, the work has become, if anything, worse than ever. So this is a chopped up panoramic photo of the process of a beef plant. I think this is in the armor plant. And what the meatpackers have done is a process called DeSkilling. So essentially taking all of the skill out of the job. So as they broke the union in 1904, what they did after that was chase the skilled workers out of the industry and make everything a discrete task. So the easiest way to think of this is, as it was called at the time, a disassembly line. And this is actually one of the places where Henry Ford gets his idea in reverse for the Model T, is that if you take a bunch of parts and put them together, you get a car. He gets the idea from here. You start with a cow, you take a series of steps, and you get 100 different products you can sell. So the work is extremely monotonous. It's extremely dangerous. If you remember, again, all the stories from the jungle about people who have cut their hands so many times their fingers don't work, getting tuberculosis from working in freezer rooms, things like that. Most of the workers are paid 20 cents a day and are working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. So the work itself is extremely grim. More importantly, however, you have this sudden influx of African Americans into the city of Chicago through the Great Migration. So this is the famous, enormous process by which African Americans flee the South and come racing to the north to cities like Chicago. So this is one of the most famous photos of the Great Migration. It's often, for reasons I don't know, this is called an unidentified family. They actually are identified. This is the Arthur family. This is a family from Paris, Texas. And they are fleeing because the farmer who owns the farm that they sharecropped on assaulted their son. The son fought back, and so a mob burned him at the stake. So I do think it's important to think about the stakes that are involved here and the reasons people are coming north and kind of honoring the stories of people like the Arthur family. So very obvious push factors of fleeing the Jim Crow South, but pull factors too. Things like the Chicago Defender, the famous nationally circulated black newspaper promising Chicago as a land of hope, saying that it's a place where African Americans can live a life of dignity and can also achieve high-paying employment, relatively high-paying employment. So between 1910 and 1920, Chicago's black population more than doubles. So this is kind of a big map here. It's kind of hard to see, so this is an inset showing the black population in 1910. And then in 1920, you can see the expansion eastward of what is called the Black Belt or the Black Metropolis. Significantly for us, by the time of the riots, the Stockyards employ about 40,000 people, 12,000 are African Americans. So whatever misgivings the packing bosses had about employing African Americans, about the possibility of violence on the floor, that is all faded now with the arrival of this very large, mostly unskilled, and largely low-paid workforce. So Fitzpatrick and Foster think this is the perfect time to push things forward, to create a union that has diversity in ethnic terms, national terms, racial terms, organizing men and women together, skilled and unskilled. And so in 1916, they inaugurate what is called the Stockyards Labor Council. And initially, the union has a great deal of success. So that's Fitzpatrick speaking to a huge meeting of meatpacking workers. This is in what's called Packing Town, which is in the Stockyards district. This is the area described by Sinclair in the jungle. So you can see the enormity of the crowds. This is also a mass campaign that's organizing everyone. So one of the first things they do is hire and train a cadre of black organizers. They have someone writing for the Chicago Whip, which is a black newspaper. The union very aggressively pursues grievances filed by African American workers, especially those about racial discrimination. And the high point for the SLC comes in 1917. So this is during World War I. And the SLC feels sufficiently empowered to threaten a strike if their demands aren't met. And because it's during wartime, the government basically freaks out and appoints a judge to mediate the dispute. And the lawyer working for the union, Frank Walsh, calls a number of African Americans to the stand. They discuss the low wages, the poor conditions, but they also discuss the discrimination they've suffered. And Walsh gives this very stirring oration saying, from this point on, the white man's unions are going to show that they're loyal to the rights of the black man as they are to the white man. And the mediator grants the union full recognition, a wage increase, equal pay for men and women, protection from racial discrimination, among other things. So a full victory for the union. It's estimated that about 90% of white workers and 50% of black workers join the Stockyards Labor Council. So if this union was such a success, the question then becomes, why only 50% of the black workers? So there's a few problems with the SLC that we can trace directly back to 1904 and then trace directly forward to 1919. If you recall the legacy of the 1904 strike, the idea of black workers being suspicious of unionism as being primarily for white people only, that they'd be violently sort of chased out of a union, that their rights would not be protected. White workers feeling that African Americans are perhaps not fit for unionism, that they don't have solidarity, these sort of racist stereotypes. All of this comes back into play. So for one thing, for obscure jurisdictional reasons that I won't get into, lest we all fall asleep, the SLC is technically not allowed to organize everybody into one union. They can't technically do that because of their charter. So the way that they circumvent this is by organizing people through neighborhoods. And the idea of this is it would strengthen the union by tying it to people's ethnic and religious communities. So the idea is if you are a Lithuanian immigrant, you live in the Lithuanian neighborhood, you're in a Lithuanian union. So the people you see at work, at the union hall, at the saloon, on your street corner, right? These are all the same people. So you have a greater sense of solidarity. The problem with this, as I'm sure several of you are already considering, is that Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in America. And so the union that represents the Black Belt area, which is Local 651, is by default essentially a de facto segregated union, and inevitably comes to be known as Colored Local 651, or in less charitable moments, the Jim Crow Local. So African Americans chafe immediately at this idea that they're being forced into essentially a segregated union local. There's also issues of the black workers themselves. So the majority of members of the SLC, black members of the SLC who stick around, who are very active in the union, are native-born Chicagoans. For migrants from the South, they have very little experience with unions, and what little they do is extremely negative, even more exclusionary and violent than unions in the North. So they would not necessarily have been enthusiastic about joining the union, and in fact were not, especially because with the advent of the Great Migration, there are a number of community-based alternatives to unionism. So this is a card from the Urban League that was widely circulated among recently arrived black migrants. So you have the Urban League, the Wabash Avenue YMCA, countless numbers of churches, fraternal organizations, things like that, that are serving a lot of the same purposes that a union would. So things like securing employment, mediating workplace disputes, purchasing things like disability insurance, the like, that a union could serve, right? Those are the same things a union can do, but this is a black organization that is specifically assisting the black community, and you don't have to deal with things like a de facto segregated local area. You don't have to deal with paternalistic white leadership. The response of the union, too, it should be noted, is pretty cold to all of this. So when black members complain about Local 651 being a de facto segregated local, they are told by union leadership that actually it's better for them to have their own organization with their own leaders. When the black workers say, no, it's actually not what they want, the leadership essentially says, yes, it is what you want. There's even Fitzpatrick, who's generally very progressive, especially for his time on racial issues, responded to low membership among the African-American community by saying, the poor, deluded, colored, non-union man allows himself to be exploited by the packers to the detriment of his own fellow Negroes and to the great injury of the white worker, too. So trucking in a lot of these very ugly racist stereotypes about African Americans being almost servile and not really fitting into the vision of the union. So one thing we know about the race riot of 1919 is that it is not an event that occurs fully spontaneously, that this is something that had been building for several months and even years. The thing that is always cited here, the bombings of black homes that occur starting in 1917. The same thing happens on the shop floor in the Stockyards. So in testimony before the federal mediator in the summer of 1919, it's recalled that gangs of white union workers would wait outside the Stockyards gates, and if any black worker came out without a union button, he'd be hit over the head and shoved back inside and told, don't come out until you sign a card. Another case where a union worker physically threatened a non-union worker, and the non-union black worker beat him into unconsciousness with a pipe. Workers regularly coming to work with revolvers and knives concealed in their clothes for fear of a race war in the Stockyards. So when the riot finally occurs, it's sort of the culmination of a lot of these tensions and a lot of this anger that's been seething for a couple of years now. So the riot itself, which we know explodes in July 1919 with the murder of Eugene Williams and the refusal of police to arrest his killer. This leaves 38 people dead, lasts for 8 days, consumes much of the South Side in particular. There are a couple of things about the riot that are significant, though, from a labor perspective. So one is, unlike contemporaneous riots, I'm thinking of Springfield, Illinois in 1908, East St. Louis in 1917, and Tulsa in 1921. These other riots are more like massacres, or pogrom would probably be the best word, in which whites are trying to chase African Americans out of the city. In the Chicago race riot, there are pitched battles back and forth between white and black citizens. So one thing that sociologists cite here is that no women are killed during the riot, that this is almost a war, essentially, between white and black, with casualties on both sides. So that's going to make the rebuilding of the city much more difficult because they're seen by both sides as being aggrieved, that both sides are going to be seeking justice or even vengeance. The other thing is that 41% of the injuries sustained during the riot and several deaths are in what's called the Stockyards district. So this is, north is pointing this way. This is a map from I think this is the Tribune, where you can see the Stockyards over there. A bit toward the east is what's called the Black Belt, and then in between are the neighborhoods of Canaryville and Bridgeport, which are Irish American neighborhoods that African Americans had to cross to get to work, which are very hostile to African Americans. So the very act of going to work was kind of taking your life in your hands. So there's a very close connection now between the racial violence of the riot and the idea of going to work. So it's clear that work and labor is going to play a central role in how this is ultimately going to be resolved. The resolution from labor's perspective is that all of this is a product, again, of divisions created artificially by bosses. So during the riot, the CFL, the Chicago Federation of Labor, opens a soup kitchen that's open to black and white workers 24 hours a day. It publishes a very bold editorial saying that white workers have not only a responsibility to refrain from violence, but to prevent violence from being visited upon black citizens, as they say, not because the unions had anything to do with starting the present trouble, but because of their advantageous position to help end it. And it's a bit difficult to tell because the records don't have a box for a union member for each of the police reports, but based on what we can piece together, it does seem like union members did not participate in the violence in very large numbers, that the union kind of restrained its members. So the riot ends on August 3rd, and the big question remaining is, what's going to happen, right? What's going to happen when the Stockyards reopen, when all of these people, black and white, are put back into the same place, the same rooms in some areas, some of them with axes and knives, right? So the union, not surprisingly, again, blames this on employers. So this is a pamphlet that was widely circulated after the riot. There's a lengthy piece in there by the secretary of the Chicago Federation of Labor that blames all of this on employers, right? That what they've done is set white against black in a battle over pay and conditions and things like that. Famously, the heads of the CFL want J. Ogden Armour charged with conspiracy to commit murder. That doesn't go anywhere, as you can imagine. But they clearly feel that the race riot is purely a product of the divisions created by packing bosses and the like. So on Thursday, August 7th, this is the kind of flashpoint that would really shatter this tenuous alliance, or what's left of it. The Packers announced their plan. They're going to reopen the Stockyards with militia and police inside the Stockyards to preserve order, make sure there's no further violence. The union responds to this with fury, the union meaning union leadership, simply because of the long history of police and especially militia being used to break strikes, and especially in Chicago. There's a very, very bloody history going well back into the 19th century of militia being used against strikers. And one union organizer says, "My men don't want to work with a Boy Scout with a bayonet right behind them," sort of mocking the militia. And in a bit more ominous tone says, "5 days of race riots have our white workers alarmed and inflamed, and we don't know how much longer we can control them." Their solution to this is to say, keep the militia and the police out of the Stockyards, and we, the union, will reopen them and we'll be responsible for security. We will keep order. Black workers respond to this with incredulity, as you can imagine. So Robert Abbott of The Defender says, "We confess that our experience with organized labor in this locality has not been reassuring," and says that this is a very foolish plan and that in fact black workers actually would prefer the militia and police to remain, which is not surprising. They've just been through 8 days of rioting where you have people driving through the Black Belt firing indiscriminately into houses. Most damningly, the black union local 651, publicly slams this plan as being contrary to their own interests, saying this is a malicious attempt to prevent members of our race from returning to their places of employment, and we demand every means of protection that we as law-abiding citizens should receive. So this ultimately shatters this tenuous alliance between white and black workers. In response, 15,000 white workers walk out of the Stockyards. Their main demand is that the militia and police be removed from the workplace. but there are also several complaints about black workers in particular. So some of the demands include their anger at, quote, the intention of the Packers to disrupt the unions by the use of non-unionized colored labor, a demand that the Packers choose once and for all between white and colored employees. And so, as the Daily News puts it, this is very clearly a double protest against the presence in the yards of military and police and the readmittance to the yards of colored workers. So in labor history, this is what we call a hate strike. So this is a strike that is essentially against the presence of black workers here in the yards. The problem for Fitzpatrick in this case is that he can't disavow the strike because he wants the militia out too, but he can't support it because it's very clearly a strike that is directed against African American workers. The strike itself, compared to what we've talked about before, is actually relatively quiet. Nothing much happens. Most of the strikers come back within 4 days without achieving any of their goals. But as a byproduct of this, the SLC is essentially ended as an organizing body. And African Americans flee the union in large numbers, as you can imagine. The SLC makes one more last-ditch attempt to organize the stockyards and execute a strike in 1921 and 1922, but the strike is a complete failure, and it is broken largely through the use of black strikebreakers who have abandoned the union because the union, they feel, has abandoned them. So the things to take from this, I think, one is that the CFL did have some legitimately progressive goals. But the union was also tainted from its leadership all the way down to its membership on the shop floor by erroneous, very odd ideas, frankly, about black workers and their sense of solidarity and where they fit, ideas that ranged from insulting and paternalistic to toxic and violent. And because of this, leadership fooled themselves into believing that racial issues could be solved purely through labor action, which is simply not the case. And in a period where the black population of Chicago was growing rapidly and the racial consciousness of black Chicagoans is also growing rapidly, this appeal quickly held very little interest for black Chicagoans, and the union drive fell short. So I think that this sheds some light on the very wrong-headed attempts of the union to efface the racial aspects of a racial problem, and I think also sheds some light on some of the larger reverberations of the race riot in terms of where it came from and where it led the city ultimately. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We have time for questions from the audience.
This is kind of so obvious that I almost hesitate to ask it, but a lot of the upheavals of 1919, generally, not just in Chicago, the common wisdom and even the wisdom at the time said, well, it's because the boys went overseas and they saw all these new things and they lived in different cultures and they so forth and so on, and then they came back and etc. I mean, you know the narrative. Did any of that actually play out during the strike?
It's difficult to say during the strike, but that is certainly an aspect of this. I think that's recorded in some of the CFL minutes and certainly in a lot of the discourse coming from the black community. So reading The Defender, The Whip, other publications that are claiming that African Americans fought for the US and therefore they have the same right to, be in a union as anyone else and not in some, sort of shunted off, marginalized, segregated corner of the union. If you're thinking about the race riot too, certainly the sort of armed self-defense aspect of it is very much influenced by World War I. But something I think that gets lost a bit too is a lot of the fury of the race riot is about competition for jobs. That's a lot of what's bubbling under the surface. And much of that comes from this enormous wave of troops coming back to Chicago. And the sense that the white troops are eligible for jobs and that the black troops sort of need to wait in line, right? Which is sort of the prevailing view among white Chicagoans at the time.
David, I wanted to ask that you made the key point that one of the major mistakes of the Stockyards Labor Council was to organize along ethnic lines, the Lithuanians and the Lithuanian Council, and et cetera. And he said it was a very complicated reason why they couldn't do this, and it was very technical, but it strikes me that that was a major mistake at the time. Is there any way to give us a hint about why technically they couldn't do this without driving, without too much detail?
Yeah. So the essentially the Chicago Federation of Labor is chartered through the American Federation of Labor, which is a trade union organization. So it only organizes skilled workers. So the AFL had sort of a backdoor for unskilled workers that were called federal labor unions. So usually the way this would work is if you want to organize a union of carpenters, they would be chartered as a local under the carpenters union. Federal labor unions are just chartered through the American Federation of Labor itself. So that's essentially what they tried to do here. So rather than setting up 10 different unions for each different trade, they would just set up a bunch of different local unions that were just by neighborhood that were chartered directly with the CFL rather than by trade. So that's a way that you could lump unskilled and skilled workers together and sort of get around the jurisdictional piece. So in terms of the technical aspect of it, it wasn't a bad idea, but if you take 2 seconds looking at a demographic map of Chicago, it clearly was never going to work. There was always going to be, African Americans sort of pushed off to one end of the union and marginalized and just not able to have a voice within the Federation.
Okay. The understanding that blacks in America are race, color, caste, forcibly segregated at the bottom of society was not something that the radical left and socialist movement organized around. That understanding came from Moscow, came from Lenin and Trotsky. Lenin argued that trade unions that the trade union militant, a class struggle militant, could not be a trade union secretary. You see his role as such, that he actually had to understand that the role of the vanguard is to fight against the special oppression of black people in this country, but basically against, to be the tribune of the people, to be the tribune of the oppressed. And that really was lacking in this understanding that actually cut short the ability to understand that you just couldn't treat, for example, Debs was anti-racist to his core, but his misconception was that socialism had nothing special to offer the Negro. In that case, how the hell are you going to carry out integrated struggle if you have that as on your banner? And actually, that understanding came from their experience in Russia, the Bolshevik Party. So it is true that the understanding of the fighting against the special oppression of black people came from the Communist International under Trotsky.
So there is some of this percolating under the surface. So Foster will occasionally mention this because Foster is much, much more radical than the other leadership of the CFL. But I do think that's the central tension here, essentially, is that the union feels that if you just organize everyone together and you elevate everybody, that everybody will be okay, and having no real conception of, historic differences between different groups. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that at the same time this effort at interracial unionism kind of crashes and burns, the black community itself, in terms of its own organizations, is seeing this enormous flowering, in Chicago, in Harlem, all over the country, because it is, like you said, it's a different historical experience, right? That you can't sort of just lump everybody together and hope that it'll work out.
Have you looked at race relations in current unions? I'm a member of the Association of Pennsylvania State College and Union Faculty, and even though we have a fairness provision in our contract, implicitly the fairness is dependent upon whether management applies the fairness. So there's always a gray area in which African American faculty do not receive equity when it comes to white faculty. Have you looked at that maybe?
I haven't looked so much at contemporary unions, but I think a lot of the legacy of this comes through maybe about 15 years later than this, right? So when the packing houses are actually successfully organized in the mid-1930s with the Packing House Workers Organizing Committee, you see a union that is much more, I think, advanced than what you saw from the Stockyards Labor Council. So very invested in not just the inclusion of black workers, but the empowerment of black workers and having black leadership. But I actually think some of the problems that they run into that you start to see percolating up in the late 60s, especially in places like Detroit, is that it's not quite the naivete that Fitzpatrick has, but there is almost a sense of colorblindness, right? That all of us essentially are workers, and that if you sort of organize everybody together and give everybody an opportunity, you kind of lift all boats. But that is very dangerously close to what we saw here, right? That you're talking about groups that have very different historical experiences, that are treated very differently by management, that are gonna have very different grievances. And I think a lot of that has sort of continued on, that's sort of the model and the structure for too many unions, unfortunately, that it's very difficult to legitimately empower some of their members when they need to.
So I thought it was very interesting how you brought up other race riots that were taking place around this time, as well as the distinction between a sense of massacre versus war, which brought to mind the Elaine race riots in Arkansas that took place in the same year. So I was wondering if there was a sense of connection in terms of how these events resonated with black communities on a national scale.
That's a great question. Nationally, I'm not sure, but I can tell you that there's a great deal of concern by black Chicagoans about things like the East St. Louis riot. So that's an event that captivates all of Chicago, but especially the black community, because the riot is so intensely brutal. So that certainly is much more of a massacre than the 1919 riot in Chicago, and involves a level of brutality and horror that really is extreme and is kind of a galvanizing force for African Americans in Chicago. And I would say that it is probably one of the reasons that the Chicago riot is different, that African Americans are sort of bracing themselves for this kind of event to occur there and are prepared to defend themselves in a different way. There are other differences too. The black community in Chicago is much larger than the black community in East St. Louis, simple differences like that. But I can tell you that if you look at things like the Defender and the Whip, if you look at speeches by people like Ida B. Wells, who's in Chicago for much of this period, black preachers, there's very much a sense of awareness of these events going on and being part of a national problem that has to be responded to. And I think that also animates some of the resentment that black workers feel too, that there's this ostensibly interracial organization that really, in its actual day-to-day functioning, is not serving their needs.
Was there any connection between the early labor organizers and these so-called Irish gangs like the Regan Colts and the Hamburg Clubs?
So the gangs were central to the riot. So when we talk about African Americans having to cross Canaryville and Bridgeport, a lot of the inciting of the violence is coming from these young gangs of young men or athletic clubs, things like that. Generally speaking, the answer is no. So those gangs are primarily, especially Reagan's Cults is like an Irish gang. A lot of the Stockyards workers are Eastern European by extraction. And so different communities, different areas of the city, right? Not really as much activity in the gangs. This is partially because Irish immigrants come to the US much earlier, right? They're part of that first wave of immigration in the 1840s, whereas people from Eastern and Southern Europe are coming in the 1880s and later. So the gangs are central to the violence of the riot, but in terms of the functioning of the union, they're not quite as central.
I would like to know if there were any measures taken by the government, apart from the police presence, to try to avoid at that moment or after a situation like that?
Yes, the short answer is segregation, honestly, is that the local government is very concerned about the Great Migration and is very concerned about the influx of African Americans. And actually this is where things sort of get really messy and complicated. The Illinois Federation of Labor, and to a lesser extent the Chicago Federation of Labor, make repeated complaints to the state and city government that companies are importing, that's their word, importing black workers from the South. And their concern about this is obviously wages. That's their primary concern, is that there's going to be this huge wave of unskilled workers coming in and driving down wages in the city. So from the beginning, there's a push, like I said, this is more at the state level and less at the city level where black workers are more embedded in sort of the culture of the city, and I think there's a bit more of a level of progressivism. But certainly at the state level, very real fears by the Illinois Federation of Labor about the influx of black workers. So in Chicago in particular, there are efforts to essentially keep people in one place. So there are not actual laws, it's more de facto segregation, but these are very much encouraged by the city. African Americans who are sort of drifting outside the black belt are often harassed back, not just by citizens, but by police. So there was very much an awareness as the Great Migration is going on and the black belt is expanding that this was sort of a powder keg. And instead of taking efforts to sort of unite the city, and improve the lot of African Americans, the general response was simply to push them into as small a space as possible and restrict them from going elsewhere.
Thank you. I had a question about women in this moment. So you mentioned that they weren't really part of the fatalities of the riots themselves, but that the vision of this particular union included gender unity within that. So if you could speak a little bit about if that actually had any effect at this particular moment, and then maybe also how the disillusionment of this union affected the organization of women laborers, and particularly the race relations within that. So if someone like Ivy Wells talked about gender or women at all in this moment? Yeah, so it's an interesting question. A lot of the rhetoric around this union in particular is very masculine, because it's seen as a very masculine job, right? That you're chopping up animals, you're working with heavy tools, things like that. So there's a lot of talk about manhood, especially from black workers, right? That as men who fought in World War I, they deserve their place at the table to provide for families, things like that. Women do constitute a not insignificant portion of the workforce in the stockyards, and they are definitely organized with the SLC. So one of the things they fight for in that big federal contract is equal pay for men and women, which is a fairly progressive thing to fight for at this time, even for a union. But women are definitely relegated to another sort of backseat role. They're not really given a place of leadership. They're almost given a special space in the agenda every week to be okay, here's the report from the women's, trade union sector, that sort of thing. One place I can tell you that women do play into this in sort of an odd way is in the community connection between the union and the neighborhood locals. So for example, in the strike in 1921, there's a very famous event in which the police try to break up a demonstration in Packingtown, and women come flooding out of their houses and start beating the police with bats. And the most famous image is that they throw paprika in the eyes of police horses to sort of blind them and send them running off, because these are all Polish and Lithuanian women, things like that. So the very short answer to your question is it's very difficult to find records of women within the union, that their voice was not really brought to the front. And a lot of this was about masculinity and sort of building this very powerful sort of male union. But women were certainly part of the union, white and black women. There's a black woman organizer who's one of the first that they hire to work among African American women in the stockyards. But much like African Americans, it's sort of that they're a part of the union but not really given any leadership within it or given much of a voice.
You mentioned the DeSkilling that took place around 1904, and then presumably that takes some time. Is there an automation push at any point in this period, or is automation going to be a thing well after World War II?
I would say mechanization more than automation. So we can go back to these weird, gross photos I had before. It's more an idea of taking the skill out of it, right? So everything becomes sort of routinized and mechanized. So every person has sort of one little thing that they're doing, one chop that they're making over and over and over again. There's a very systematic aspect to this where you're not bothering really to inspect any of the meat for quality or anything. You're just kind of making the same cut, and you're taking one cow and producing X products, right? And then when you take 100 cows, they're going to produce the same X products no matter what. So not so much automation, but more the removal of skill, of talent from any of this, that workers are all eminently expendable, eminently replaceable, and very, very low paid, so that at any point, if they decide to unionize, you can fire half of them and pick up new workers at a moment's notice.
Thank you for your talk. That's really interesting. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about whether this was a debate that was going on among Black leadership in the lead up to the riot. For instance, there were Black local leaders of the union local. Were they in debate with, say, Union League leaders, and did that debate change after the riot?
Yeah, so this is, I didn't have time to get into this, but this is one of the most interesting aspects. So the position of Black community leaders is very split. So you have some members of the Black community that are very, very supportive of unionization as a path forward. So these tend to be more politically radical, generally speaking. But for the most part, the kind of middle class leadership, so if you're thinking of like Robert Abbott from The Defender, if you're thinking of ministers, certainly businessmen, aldermen, things like that, the general position is unions are okay, but you have to be careful, right? That it's a wonderful idea, but they kind of look askance given the long history, especially of Illinois unions being very exclusive racially, that sort of thing. So the local Black union, Local 651, has some connections with the Urban League, has some connections with other local ministers that they kind of leverage into using their spaces, essentially, so using churches as a meeting place, having ministers pepper their sermons with things like this. But as time goes on, you see that very much turn. And so by the time you get to the riot, and definitely afterwards, there's a definite turn by many people in the Black community saying that this really wasn't worth it, that the union had at no point really represented Black workers, and certainly after the riot is not representing their interests. The one here that's most dramatic would be the Urban League. So the Urban League early on is a public supporter of unions, although there's not a lot of material support they can offer. They encourage migrants to join unions if they can. They actually actively supply strikebreakers to the packing houses in 1921 because they are so turned against this idea of unionism and feel that that the unions have just not been meeting the needs of African Americans, especially migrants, which is kind of their special thing that they're looking after.
What became of the two leaders after the Mel movement fell apart?
So Fitzpatrick continues on for the rest of his life with the Chicago Federation of Labor. I think he dies in the 1930s, if I'm remembering correctly. But he essentially holds his position and kind of shepherds it forward. Fitzpatrick is interesting because he kind of is the same person mostly his whole life, that he has this sort of progressive vision of unionism, but he can't really execute it. And eventually other people catch up to his vision and also bring in a workable system for actually doing it by the time we get to the 30s. Foster, being much more radical, leaves the CFL after 1919, partly because the CFL helps to lead the steel strike in that year, which is extremely damaging to labor nationwide and very unsuccessful. And he writes a number of articles reflecting on his experience there, which show a very weird mix of resentment against Black workers for not joining the union and these little flashes of sort of self-awareness that maybe the union was not, that the union was at fault for that. But he becomes much more radical and later becomes head of the American Communist Party. So he definitely continues a turn, much more radical direction than where Fitzpatrick was and goes.
How long did they both live?
Fitzpatrick, I believe, lives until the late 30s, and I want to say Foster until the 40s.
Well, thank you, David, for sharing with us this tragic story of how the racism undermined unions and the unions, racism in itself undermined. Yeah, it's a very complex story, and really appreciate you pulling it apart for us today. It was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.